Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
The Pentagon sends dozens more fighter jets to the Middle East. Welcome to the Wednesday edition as the Trump administration prepares for possible military strikes against Iran. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, this is all unfolding as the administration stages a second day of talks between Ukraine and Russia in Geneva, with the idea of seeking peace in one war and maybe starting another at the same time.
Yeah, and yet those talks don't seem like they yielded much in terms of progress, with both sides describing them as somewhat difficult. And as we consider difficulties here, it also appears to be difficult in getting to hammer out the finer details of what an agreement with Iran could look like. We learned yesterday the talks in Geneva led to a general agreement, and yet Iran is going to take 2 weeks to get back to the U.S. On more details of the proposal. The question is the U.S. going to wait 2 weeks before doing something? Because as you point out, Joe, assets are moving, and they're moving in force. Even in the last 48 hours, dozens of fighter jets, attack aircraft, and interestingly, 40 refueling tankers have landed in the region, all in advance of the second aircraft carrier strike group arriving. And with the Olympics about to resolve at the end of this week, all of these coinciding make you wonder about what might come next. 2 weeks, though, is interesting. We were talking about this yesterday. The president is no stranger to the 2 week period. Of course, that only ended up being about 3 days last time. So we'll see. The matter of Ukraine is another one, Kailey, a 90-minute session that apparently led to nothing. Yeah, it was a short meeting today. Apparently, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner didn't even attend this one after trying to make some progress in the first day of talks yesterday. So we're going to get into this hour with the former ambassador to Ukraine, who's going to be joining us in studio. We'll speak with William Taylor, the former ambassador. We are laser focused on what is happening in the Middle East in terms of the deployment of U.S. military assets to the region, as President Trump is, pushing for a deal on Iran's nuclear program, but also is warning, or at least sending signals, that use of force is certainly not off the table at this time. The question, of course, for markets, as we're seeing a move higher in oil today of more than 4% on both Brent and WTI, is how realistically close could we be to another potential attack on Iran, knowing we just saw one of these back in June on Iran's nuclear program specifically. We asked this question to a member of the House Intelligence Committee on Balance of Power yesterday evening. Democratic Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy was with us, and this is what he told us. I'm concerned that we're going to potentially end up in another war in the Middle East. We don't want that. The American people don't want that, and that's something that comes out loud and clear. All that being said, Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. It cannot have a nuclear weapon. And I'm glad that there's negotiations also with regard to ending their ballistic missile program and their nefarious activities in the region. But let's do it diplomatically. Let's negotiate this diplomatically in concert with our friends, partners, and allies. Well, even as the administration pursues this diplomatic track, we're just dropping enormous amounts of military hardware into the region. We've already talked about the USS Jerry Ford steaming its way to the region to join the USS Lincoln carrier strike groups. To have 2 aircraft carriers is in itself pretty remarkable. When we now add in the past 48 hours, 48 F-16 fighter jets, 12 F-22s, 18 F-35s, 6 AWACS aircraft to conduct air traffic control in the midst of what could be a huge operation, according to reporting at Axios, a weeks-long operation, and some 40 refueling aircraft. We're gearing up for something. It's unclear what, as we spend some time with an expert on this matter. Our own Christina Ruffini spent many years covering the State Department and the Pentagon and joins us right now, the co-host of Bloomberg This Weekend, live in New York. Christina, it's great to see you. Why would you move this much hardware if you did not plan to use it?
That's the thing. You know, sources I've talked to said they are feeling a little better after these talks. Obviously no breakthroughs, but they're feeling a little bit more positive. The caveat is that's a lot of military hardware. And as we've seen historically, when you have these big guns, you tend to want to use them. And people are getting really nervous about this. A couple reasons. One of the theories is the president is bullish on this coming off of a fairly successful maneuver, if you're looking at what he wanted to achieve in Venezuela, Iran is not Venezuela, right? The U.S. has assets. The U.S. has allies throughout the Middle East. That even a wounded Iran, even a limited IRGC can hit back and can hit back badly. So this is where you're getting even some Republicans saying, let's take a more diplomatic approach. But the U.S. is saying to Iran, listen, you've got 2 weeks to come back with a better plan. The question is, do they mean that, or is that lip service? So they can say, look, we tried, we don't like their plan, now we're taking kinetic action. That's something Israel would certainly like to see. We'll have to see where this ends up.
Yeah, and we'll have to see if Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are the two individuals who are able to bring real progress on the diplomatic front, despite not being diplomats themselves, Christina. But not being diplomats hasn't stopped them from being involved in these talks or the talks that they were brokering between Russia and Ukraine, which after less than 2 hours today, don't seem to have yielded progress in the second day. Are we getting any closer to potential resolution on some of the big sticking point issues, like the issue of territory in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe they were trying to save air miles, consolidate time. You know, we got 2 negotiations, no waiting. They obviously weren't in the room for a lot of the Iran negotiations, but all the delegations were there, moving from hotel to hotel. The thing with the Russian negotiations, you have to look at them. Zelensky is now accusing Russia of dragging out these negotiations. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to remember that Russia is not negotiating for optics with Ukraine. The person Russia is trying to get to do things in that room is the U.S. Russia is trying to show just enough flexibility, just enough impetus to convince the White House that they're trying, so that so that they can keep President Trump on side and saying that they're doing their best. I think that's incredibly frustrating for the Ukrainians. It's obviously you can hear my voice. I've been out in the cold here in New York. It's much colder in Ukraine, and the forces are depleted and exhausted. The longer this war drags on, probably the better for Russia. And they're taking advantage of that time in the room there. Zelensky needs the White House to hold Moscow to account. We've seen flirtations with that, but they haven't really done that yet. And so that's another thing. It's a big waiting game as well to see how much pressure Washington wants to put on Russia.
All right, Christina Ruffini, co-host of Bloomberg This Weekend, joining us from New York. Thank you so much. And for more on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which I would remind you, as of next Tuesday, will have marked a 4-year milestone of that war. And joining us now is William Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So we're call it 4 years into this thing, Mr. Ambassador, and it's good to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. After persisting for 4 years, we have not seen any real change of tune or desire on the part of Vladimir Putin to, at the very least, capture the territory in Ukraine that Russia currently holds. And we understand that the territory issue is the one that really is holding things up here. How is that possibly going to get resolved when you have Zelensky saying they aren't willing to hand any of it over to Russia?
There are two opposite views. You're exactly right. There's no overlap. The Ukrainians want to be a country. They want to be a sovereign country. They want to live European. The Russians want them to surrender. The Russians want to dominate Ukraine, take it over. There's no middle ground there. Now, there is a way to get to some kind of a ceasefire. But Christine put it exactly right. President Trump needs to put the pressure on Putin. Putin, without that pressure, is not going to agree to anything.
You're a diplomat. You want to talk by nature, to keep talking, to solve problems. When is it appropriate not to talk? Is it not now?
Talking, Joe, is fine. Talking is fine.
But it's also rewarding sometimes to give someone like Putin a platform to talk.
Talking is fine, but you're exactly right. What that does is drag it out. And Putin has been dragging it out because he wants to grind away at the Ukrainians day after day, month after month, year after year. As you say, coming up on 4 years. Putin thinks that this grind will eventually allow him to win. He thinks that the Ukrainians will someday give up. They won't. He thinks someday the Europeans will back away from Ukraine. They're not. Europeans are really stepping up. Putin hopes that the Americans will get tired and lose interest. And so far, to be fair to the Trump administration, they've not given up.
Yeah.
They're still focused. I mean, they're there in Geneva today.
But as you suggest, there's more pressure that they could put on. As we talk about Putin dragging this on, continuing on with this war, he has to be able to continue to fund the war machine in order to do that. So is that really where the screws need to be tightened?
2 screws need to be tightened, and that's one of them. Absolutely right. Putin funds this war by selling oil and gas to the world. And he uses this shadow fleet, these tankers, these old tankers that evade the sanctions. And these old tankers move oil from Russia to India and really to China. And President Trump has shown that he knows how to crack down on the shadow fleet. That would be a big hit to the Russian ability. But the second piece, the second screw, is long-range weapons for the Ukrainians. These are the Tomahawks. This would allow the Ukrainians to put a real dent into the Russian war machine. Going after military targets in Russia, that could do it. Those 2 things on the military side and on the economic side.
Russia seems to think, according to the narrative here in Washington, that there's a window of opportunity here before the administration starts to bear down on midterms, focus on domestic issues. You've got the president's attention here. Maybe we can get something favorable to Moscow, knowing that, of course, Vladimir Putin has offered nothing really to Ukraine. Does that create a dangerous moment when you have Donald Trump hoping to make a deal? He's assembling the Board of Peace here tomorrow. And Vladimir Putin hoping to get this done in a certain period of time? Or does it not work that way in the world of diplomacy?
I think it won't work that way, Joe. I think the reason it won't is if President Trump thinks he can lean on the Ukrainians, who are the victors, who want to be the victors, and they are the victims so far. If President Trump thinks he can lean on the Ukrainians as the victims, that's not a win. That's not a win. If he forces a surrender, a capitulation, which the Ukrainians will resist, totally resist. But if that's what Trump tries to do, he'll fail. He'll fail. He doesn't want to be a loser. That would be a loss.
Well, so let's talk about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, in this, because he obviously has made great effort to stay on side with the Trump administration, knowing how poorly things had gone in the past, if we all think back to that meeting in the Oval Office last year. At the same time, President Trump does seem to be, at least for this time being, less patient with Volodymyr Zelensky than he is with Vladimir Putin. So how does Zelensky, as a head of state, have to navigate that kind of relationship? How difficult is this moment for him, knowing he doesn't want to have to give up? He doesn't want to have to surrender, whatever President Trump
Kelly,
wants.
you're exactly right. It's very difficult. He will not surrender. Zelensky will not surrender, even if he's under great pressure from President Trump. And President Trump needs to understand that will not be a success. That will not be successful. And President Zelensky is doing 2 things. He's trying to keep the Americans supportive. He's done everything. He's done pretty well, actually, since that horrible meeting last year. He's done that pretty well. But at the same time, he's building up the capabilities himself, defense industrial capabilities in Ukraine, as well as the Europeans providing not only the funds, but also the weapons. So he's doing both things. He's trying to keep the Americans on board, but at the same time become more independent.
New York Times column today, Trump bets on diplomacy without diplomats. And David Sanger shares the byline to write that some Russians have now taken to calling the duo Witkoff and Zayatkoff, because Zayat is Russian for son-in-law. The Iranians also have a nickname for Kushner, using the Persian word for son-in-law, Damad Trump, defining his influence by virtue of his marriage to the president's daughter. What do you think of that as a career diplomat?
You do need, as we talked earlier, Joe, we need to talk. Diplomats do talk.
Does that bring leverage, though, that someone else might not have?
What brings leverage is connection to the one man who's making the decision.
So this is a good thing, then?
This gives them credibility. This gives them credibility. And more credibility than lower-level diplomats would certainly have. So yes, if Witkoff and Kushner can bring a deal because they've got Trump sitting right behind them, then that's a fine thing. That's whatever gets that peace, the just and lasting peace, that will be fine.
Well, but this is not their exclusive area of focus. As we noted in Geneva yesterday, they went to the Ukraine-Russia talks after the Iran nuclear talks. Is there not some kind of conflict in being able to address these 2 things adequately?
Addressing it adequately is the right question. These are both complicated issues. Very complicated. They've gone back years. Both of them have gone back years. And there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of nuance there. It's a complicated, both are complicated issues. You got to hope that they're getting some support from some other parts of the government because they don't have it themselves. They need to have that kind of support.
We were struck by the post on Twitter from Zelensky following the first meeting and ahead of the second, which, by the way, was over in 90 minutes, we understand. He wrote, "Yesterday's meetings were indeed difficult, and we can state that Russia is trying to drag out negotiations that could already have reached the final stage. I thank the American side," he says, "for its attention to detail and patience in conversations with the current representatives of Russia." So now you've got Ukraine apologizing for Russia at the table on top of it. I'm sure he's got a little bit of a wink as he's writing that, Ambassador. But what does that tell you about his posture before a third meeting?
So the Ukrainians have sent very senior people. The head of the delegation is the chief of staff. The other head of the delegation is the National Security and Defense Council. And then there's a deputy Ministry of Defense person. They've got a senior folks there. They got a group of senior people. The Russians don't. The Russian delegation was headed by, I think, a deputy culture minister earlier. So that suggests to you that, again, even on the Russian side, there's not a depth of understanding.
We have just a minute left, Ambassador, but coming off of the Munich Security Conference this weekend, were you encouraged by what we heard from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, in contrast to J.D. Vance last year, what it means for not just Ukraine, but other European allies?
Compared to the J.D. Vance speech, yes. But the message was basically the same, Kailey. The message was the same. Pretty much America first. But the other big message coming out of that was where he went next, where Rubio went next. I mean, he went to Slovakia and he went to Hungary. That tells you that there's not a change in message.
All right, we appreciate you joining us and your expertise. The former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio on Balance of Power. And we have much more still ahead. We'll speak with our political panel, Sarah Chamberlain and Kristen Hawn, up ahead. Plus, we have to talk about the economy as well. Mark Zandi of Moody's will be here to do that with us. So stay with us right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where we are now on day 5 of the partial government shutdown, specifically of the Department of Homeland Security, which has not been funded since midnight Friday, amid a dispute between Republicans and Democrats over reforms to ICE. We understand that there have been proposals and counterproposals traded, but no real signs of progress yet that would bring an end to this shutdown in particular. And Joe, it seems that the issues that the two sides are focused on that seem intractable on both sides are no closer to getting solved. The issue of removing masks for ICE agents and requiring that they have judicial warrants. Republicans will tell you that is a non-starter, and Democrats say funding this department is a non-starter without it. Yeah, the news today is there's no news on this front, which is really why we're starting to ask whether we could have a record partial shutdown, because no one's budging on this. Hakeem Jeffries saying a bill is not going to move without meaningful, bold, transformational changes to ICE's conduct. And what they're seeing so far apparently doesn't fulfill that idea. We're in a situation, Kailey, where it seems like both sides think that they've moved and they're waiting for the other to go further. Both think they're winning, and you know how dangerous that can be. Well, yeah, and remember, both Democrats felt that they were winning the last shutdown. Correct. And then it was ultimately Democrats who decided to end it without actually getting the policy on health care that they wanted to. Right. Are they going to repeat that this time around? This is why people love Washington, and we assemble our political panel for their take on this. They've been through a couple of these, including Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, who is with us here in our D.C. bureau, Republican Main Street Partnership president and CEO, sharing some time today with Kristen Hawn, our Democratic strategist and partner at ROKK Solutions. Kristen, you heard the words of Hakeem Jeffries. He says ICE is out of control and they need to be reined in, and the American people know it. This has not changed the boundaries of this debate, however. Kailey just pointed it out. Demasking and warrants are non-starters for Republicans, and they are mandatory for Democrats. So how do we get to the next stage of this?
I mean, I think, well, first of all, everybody's going to have to come back into town. You said this is why everybody loves Washington. I'm not exactly sure that that's true. No. But, you know, I think that, you know, like the Democrats have been talking about those two issues all along. They're seeing the public rise up, not just in states, but all over the country, not just in states where some of these tragedies have occurred at the hands of ICE agents. So, they're being reactive and responsible to the American people, and at least for now, believe that they're on the right side of this. And not only are they on the right side of it, like you said, when both sides believe they are winning the communications agenda, the political argument, they have very little incentive to come to the table. Eventually, when you're talking about TSA agents and other things that impact people's lives, and not just the employees, but also air travel and other things like that, I think that's when people will eventually come to the table. But as we discussed in the last segment, it could be a very long, drawn-out shutdown.
Well, the longer it goes on, Sarah, the closer we get to the midterm. So when we consider incentives here, electorally speaking, if you are a moderate Republican in a swing district, one of the ones that the DCCC is targeting, do you want to have voted for reforms to ICE given the public sentiment that Kristen was talking about, or does that risk backfiring with the base? I just wonder what the calculus here and who they need to try to win over.
Well, they do want to do reforms to ICE. They've done reforms to ICE. I mean, they've offered a lot. No, they haven't offered the mass because so many of the ICE agents are in danger themselves. People figure out who they are. They go to their families' homes. So they want to prevent that. But we've come a long way. We've pulled them out of Minnesota. We've agreed to cameras. I mean, we've agreed to a lot. It's just we don't know what the Democrats want. The Democrats are making this political, where the Republicans are trying to make this like, listen, they're being funded anyway, and I think that's a key part that's being missed. In the big, beautiful bill, the ICE agents are being funded. It is FEMA, it is Coast Guard, and it is TSA that's really paying the price
Well,
here.
Since you brought up the big, beautiful bill, I have to wonder if somehow this doesn't end up being resolved by another reconciliation package that Republicans can just push through on partisan lines if Democrats are never going to agree to a bipartisan funding compromise. Could you see that happening?
Potentially, but we don't want to have to do that either. We really want the Democrats to come to the table with a legitimate plan to get this done. We saw what happened with ACA. The Democrats ended up opening the government with us. Did ACA get fixed? No. And nobody's even talking about it anymore. So we just think this is another political ploy by the Democrats.
Is this an opportunity for the president to lay the stakes next week in the State of the Union, or is this a liability to actually step into the speaker's rostrum and have a piece of the government closed?
I think he talks about it in the State of the Union. Yeah. I think he talks about it as far as FEMA and TSA and the Coast Guard. I mean, they're really paying the price. And you know what? We're paying the price here in Washington with what is happening in the Potomac.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is a tragedy that's going on. We need FEMA to help fix this, and they're not getting paid.
Well, and so this gets back to what you were talking about, Kristen. FEMA, TSA, the Coast Guard, all of these things. For how long, realistically, do you think Democrats are going to be able to withstand knowing that these people serving in these roles are going without paychecks? Can it be longer than 43 days? Would you see that same group of more moderate Democrats saying, all right, I'm folding here. We gotta open this back up?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think nobody wants to see the government or any part of the government shut down, because people suffer when that happens. But we're talking about who's paying the price for federal policies. People all over this country, and hardworking, even legal immigrants to this country, and American citizens are paying the price for how ICE has operated in many of these states across the country. And so, you're looking at how do we change a lot of these policies, and clearly the Republicans have a different idea of what's reasonable than the Democrats do. But the Democrats have been consistent in the beginning. Doesn't make it any less difficult. And the Republicans do have control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. So it eventually would behoove everybody to come to the table, and really sit down and talk about what's happening. To say that one side is purely playing politics and the other side doesn't care about it at all is disingenuous.
Well, I'm curious about the conversation that was had last evening at the Capitol Hill Club, which a lot of folks are talking about. Susie Wiles had members of the cabinet there. Sarah, you're a pollster. President Trump's preferred pollster, Tony Fabrizio, had some important lessons to be taught when it comes to messaging, specifically around affordability. But I'm wondering As the president prepares to deliver this speech in Georgia on affordability this week and a State of the Union next, immigration is still a huge issue for Republicans here. Helped to get this president elected and a lot of members. This is a winning issue. But Democrats point to new polling since these two fatal shootings in Minneapolis. More than half of U.S. adults, 55%, disapprove of the president's handling, specifically of immigration. This is a Yahoo YouGov poll that made a lot of waves last week. 41% approve. How worried are members about losing the issue of immigration to Democrats?
They are concerned about it, and what they're doing is going back and talking about the border has been shut. I mean, obviously, under President Biden, it was wide open. That has been a great success of the Trump administration. We need to focus on that. The other things we're kind of putting on the side. Obviously, it was a great tragedy that 2 people died in Minnesota. We don't forget that. But what we're trying to do is we shut the border. Now we're pivoting to talking about economic issues, because that's where the American people really are. Yes, they're concerned about immigration, but they're really much more concerned about paying their bills.
Well, so how do Democrats try to make sure they dominate the affordability narrative, Kristen, if President Trump is maybe going to do the tour we were promised on affordability? It seems it's going to be resuming in Georgia tomorrow. Unclear if that is going to continue beyond, but he's going to try, or at least Susie Wiles would like him to try to dominate the affordability conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult when the president is in the opposite party from you because he or she have the bully pulpit. And so, I think the Democrats have done a really good job of getting through on the issue of affordability. I'm not saying the Democrats are always good at staying concise and on message, but on this issue they have, even during the last government shutdown when they were talking about, the healthcare subsidies, which are the crux of the debate. They were talking about in the context of affordability for all Americans across this country with regard to their own healthcare. So I think that we continue to recruit really good candidates, which we have across this country, who continue to talk about those kitchen table issues that we're all going to talk about and really relate to people at a local level.
I suspect that members, and maybe yourself, will be watching the president's speech tomorrow night in Rome, Georgia, pretty closely. This is going to be a test drive, I'm guessing, for some ideas in the State of the Union. How important will it be for him to work out that part of the speech that appears to be the most important thing to the Republican mainstream?
It is extremely important that he deliver a good speech, that he stay on topic, because the men and women, especially in the Republican Main Street Partnership, are going to need that come November. So we're hoping, Susie Wiles does a great job as the chief of staff. She'll get him out there and keep him focused, and he'll start delivering. We have done a lot on affordability. I mean, the housing bill that passed a couple weeks ago that Mike Flood did, I mean, the lower prescription drug prices, we're working on it, but it does take time, and it's really only been a year.
She notes the housing bill, Kristen, which passed with a massive bipartisan majority. Is that the last real legislative work we're going to see in this Congress? Because now it's getting into electoral politics and all the actual legislating is going to be put to the wayside.
Yeah, I mean, if there's anything that's going to be done, it's going to have to be something that's hugely bipartisan. But I think, the closer and closer we even get to July and people start leaving town to really focus on their reelections, I wouldn't guess that there would be a lot more that would get done except for what absolutely has to be done in the election year. And then, depending on what happens post-election, if the Democrats do take over, there will likely be an onslaught of legislation coming forward by the Republicans before they officially lose the chamber. So that's something to look forward to and plan for as well.
All right, Kristen Hawn and Sarah Chamberlain, thank you both so much for joining us. And we'll have more on housing, both the supply and demand side of it, and how the Federal Reserve fits into the equation ahead of today's Fed Minutes with Mark Zandi of Moody's Analytics. He's next on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu here in Washington, where we are counting down less than 18 minutes from now to the minutes from the Federal Reserve's last meeting. That means, by nature, of course, they are backward looking, and I'm not sure how much the market will care about the minutes in a narrative that seems to be dominated specifically by artificial intelligence. At least that's been the story for the last few weeks. And for more, we turn to Christina Aquino, who's managing editor for the Bloomberg Markets Live blog. And Christine, we spoke about this yesterday, how we have seen so much volatility around this AI trade. Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? What does it all mean for U.S. markets that have been dominated by technology and have been exceptional for that reason? But we're seeing a pretty positive tape today. So are the fears resolved for now? Is this just buying of dips? What is it?
Yeah, it seems like there is a little bit of that buying opportunity that investors are taking advantage of today, Kailey. Certainly, yesterday we spoke about a 10% drawdown in some of these tech stocks that are still very attractive prospects, all things considered, right? Especially when you consider that they have monster cash flows, they still have a positive growth trajectory. And even though we did see a bit of a stumble toward the end of last year and into early 2026, it does seem like they've gotten to levels now where some investors are saying, you know what, maybe it's time to pile in a little bit, and that's helping price action today.
So I guess Palo Alto is the exception here, spending the night in the box. Christine, after the earnings report last evening, it was really interesting listening to their CEO talk to Ed Ludlow on the late edition of Balance of Power, because he thinks Wall Street is misinterpreting what's going on here. And while we do see some love for application software today, Palo Alto is not one of them, carving out new lows as we talk here in the session, which is amazing. I mean, are we still to believe that we're going to be vibe coding now our own cyber security software? Isn't there something to be said for having a credible player in that space?
Yeah, exactly. I think we're still not at the stage where vibe coding security software is a good idea, Joe. But yeah, I mean, very interesting, especially because, as you mentioned, there was a weaker than expected forecast for some of their metrics, but they also boosted key metrics like revenue and next generation security annual recurring revenue, right? So these are kind of key things that investors are watching out for. Very interesting, though, the commentary from analyst JP Morgan saying that, you know what, their mixed results actually presenting a buying opportunity. So it appears that the vibe today is very much of a buy the dip.
Fantastic, Christine. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to have Christina Aquino with us when she takes a moment away from the Markets Live blog, which you should keep your eyes on the terminal and at Bloomberg.com. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. As we count down to Fed minutes being released, it's an opportunity to kind of drill down on some of the data we've seen, but also the anecdotal evidence, with the President of the United States crafting a speech for the State of the Union address next week. He's going to be talking about affordability tomorrow in Georgia, and it's always a pleasure to have a moment with Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, joins us now live on Bloomberg TV and radio. Mark, it's great to have you, and there's, of course, some great anecdotal evidence to be had in Fed minutes as well as the Fed's beige book, and I'm wondering, because it's been a while since we've had a chance to talk with you, how you describe this moment in our economy and how the president should state next week the state of our union is what?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not president, Joe. That's a tough one. Good luck with that. My sense of the economy is depends on which part of the elephant you touch. I mean, you look at GDP, that's the value of all the things that we produce. It looks okay. We're going to get a read on that for the fourth quarter on Friday. It'll probably come in around 2.5%, which is kind of right down the strike zone. That's close to the economy's potential. But if you look at jobs, we're not creating very many. And feels like that's even before artificial intelligence kicks into any kind of gear here in terms of productivity gains. So as we see more of that going forward, I heard you talking about that just now. It's coming. We might see some job loss. So I think it depends on where you're looking. But you add it all up, you can mix it all together. It's okay. We're hanging in there. It just feels fragile to me.
Well, on the AI question, this is actually something that Bloomberg technology host Ed Ludlow posed to the San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly yesterday. Mark, this is what she told him, and then we'll have you respond.
What we're looking for is a technology to give us consistently good changes in productivity so that all industries at scale get better. Industries figure out new ways to generate revenue, new ways to do product design, new ideas to come and shape the economy. That's the thing that has a sustained productivity growth part. So it's undeniable productivity growth has gone up. What's not as clear is how long will that last?
So she speaks to the lack of clarity, the uncertainty around this question. Mark, how long is it going to take to feel the real effects are we talking about with the pace of the development of artificial intelligence and LLM models, that this could be within the span of months? Potentially, are we talking years? Is Kevin Warsh immediately going to have to answer this question when he gets to the Fed if he's confirmed?
Well, it feels like it's AI and its impacts on productivity growth are early stages. You can kind of sort of feel it in the economy over the past year. You can see it in hiring rates; they're weak. You can clearly see it in the tech sector. Tech jobs are falling, and their tech is on the front line of the impacts of AI. There's been some research that kind of sort of connects the dots, so it feels like it's starting to kick in, but just listening to the technologists and seeing the improvements in the power of these LLM models and the use of agents, it feels like we're going to get a much more significant increase in productivity growth here now going forward. It feels like underlying productivity growth right now, that's non-farm business productivity growth is probably about 2%, which is close to the long run average. But if you told me, we had this conversation a year from now, it's 2.25%. 2.5%. I say that sounds about right to me. So I think we're on the leading edges of that. And Kailey, this goes back to the point I was making earlier. We're not creating any jobs now at 2% productivity growth. What happens if we get to 2.25%, 2.5% over the next year? Will we see enough demand for other things to create enough jobs to keep unemployment down, or are we going to start to see some job loss here?
Maybe AI can help to loosen up the or the housing market at some point, Mark Zandi, because there are big questions about where we're going with housing. The president is worried that lowering housing prices will ruin people's nest eggs, and Congress is busy trying to increase not only affordability, but inventory. It's something that we talked to Congressman Mike Flood about. The Republican from Nebraska helped to author a housing bill that just recently passed. In fact, he remarks on how popular this was on Capitol Hill. Listen.
390 votes, 9 no votes. I mean, that is something to celebrate. Unfortunately, it doesn't make the news anywhere on an issue that matters, housing. The good news is in the Senate, they have a near unanimous bill that they've moved to the floor and tried to pass before. And you've got the president who has ideas about housing. So here we have House Republicans and Democrats, Senate House Republicans and Democrats, and the president all saying housing is a priority. If we can't find a deal among those three entities, there's not a deal to be had.
Are you encouraged by this effort, Mark Zandi, and is cutting red tape, which essentially what this legislation is aimed at, actually help to loosen up the housing market?
Yeah, it's encouraging, Joe. I mean, certainly the bipartisan nature of the legislation, and you had Democrats and Republicans coming together and signing a piece of legislation. A lot of moving parts there. A lot of it is certainly moving in the right direction. None of it's a game changer. That's not a criticism, because there is no game changers here in terms of the housing market. And it took us, since the financial crisis to kind of get into this mess with regard to the severe shortage of affordable housing. It's going to take us a while to get out. So, this is a difficult problem, but it's a good piece of legislation. I mean, just give you a sense of it. In my mind, looking at the plethora of different parts of the legislation, the one thing that stood out was the elimination of the permanent chassis for manufactured housing. Now, that sounds really in the weeds, but that could be really important for manufactured housing. That's about 100,000 units every year. That goes to low middle-income households, really helps with affordability, particularly in the South and the West, where that's a larger part of the housing stock. So, that's the kind of thing that was in the bill. Again, not a game changer, but certainly the direction of travel here, very, very positive.
Well, and on the subject of direction of travel and timing specifically, this bill obviously is meant to focus on the supply side, actually creating more housing, whereas the kind of rate mechanism from the Federal Reserve is more focused on demand. What happens if addressing the supply side, which to your point seems like it has a longer time horizon, you actually have to get these things built and available to buy, happens at a lag compared with rates potentially going down and unlocking more demand with cheaper mortgages? Could it actually create a much larger problem before it creates the solution?
Yeah, great point. This legislation that was passed, it feels really good because it's on the supply side of the housing market to, build more units to alleviate the shortage that we're suffering through. A lot of the other proposals that have come forward, a lot of them from the administration, are on demand side measures. So, for example, a 50-year mortgage or a portable assumable mortgage, or have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac go out and buy mortgage-backed securities to lower mortgage rates.
Right.
That juices up the demand side. And, obviously that doesn't help when you're trying to improve affordability and keep prices and rents down. So, This piece of legislation, great. The other stuff, not so much. But fortunately, I think the other stuff, not so much, is not going anywhere. I just don't think that has any kind of legs. So I think we will get some relief here as we move forward.
Do you share the president's worries that loosening up the housing market brings prices down and actually invades people's nest eggs?
Well, we don't want house prices to decline. That's not a great idea, right? I mean, 2/3 of Americans own their own home. It's the largest for many middle income Americans. That is the largest asset that they have. They don't own stocks. They're not really benefiting from the surge, and the surge in AI stocks. That's really just the well-to-do, the folks in the top part of the income and wealth distribution. So middle America, they're focused on their home. We don't want prices to decline. We want prices to kind of go flat here for a while, let incomes kind of catch up and affordability to improve. That seems to be what's happening. It feels like, house prices really haven't moved much at all since the Fed jacked up interest rates back in 2022. So now, 2, 3, 4 years ago. So that's the kind of thing we want to see. I don't think we're going to see price declines here, just because there's just not a lot of inventory. I mean, mortgage rates, while they have come down, they're still pretty elevated compared to the rates that most people have on their mortgage. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for people to list their home and move. There's not a lot of inventory, a lot of supply there. So I'm not too worried about prices declining, but we certainly don't want to see that happen.
Mark, we have less than a minute left, and I know a lot of people just write off the minutes as being too backward looking, but is there something you'll be looking for when those publish 6 minutes from now?
Well, what the message is going to be clear that we're not, the preponderance of the members didn't want to cut interest rates. The job market feels like it's stabilizing. Inflation's still too high and sticky. I think the thing that I would like to get out of the minutes, I'm not sure we will, but would like to see is just how strong that sentiment is, how broad-based that is across the committee, because that will say something about what's going to happen here in the next FOMC meeting down the road.
All right, Mark Zandi, we appreciate you joining us, as always, Chief Economist at Moody's Analytics, here with us on Balance of Power. And I would note, as we keep an eye on all things here in Washington, Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, is briefing the press right now, talking about Iran, saying President Trump has a decision to make, saying diplomacy is his first option on Iran, but that there are many reasons one could make to strike Iran. This is a story we will continue to follow. We'll have more on it in the late edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.